Hello everyone and welcome to another warm-up review. Let's get going. What molecules provide the structural framework for DNA and the nuclear envelope? These are the nuclear lamins. Next, what substances are utilized by natural killer cells to induce apoptosis in other cells? So granzymes and perforin are the substances that NK cells use to induce apoptosis. Next, what drugs interfere with microtubule functioning? So there's going to be griseofulvin. You'll have the benzimidazoles like mebendazole and thiabendazole. You have vincristine and vinblastine. You have paclitaxel, and then there's colchicine. All right, that's it for the warm-up. Let's get to that lecture.
In this video, we're going to review the anatomy of the brainstem and the spinal cord so that we can work up to unraveling the mystery of brainstem strokes. Now, the cranial nerves and the cranial nerve nuclei are covered in another video. And in this video, we're going to look at how these nuclei are arranged within the brainstem. But first, let's review the major spinal cord tracts, which obviously have to pass through the brainstem on their way to and from the brain. So the three main tracts that we're going to discuss are the dorsal columns, the spinothalamic tract, and the lateral corticospinal tract. Now, we're going to review the location of these tracts later on. For now, I just want to focus on what kinds of information these tracts carry and where they decussate. So let's start with the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. This is the pathway that carries fine touch, vibration sense, and proprioception signals from the body to the brain. The nerve fibers carrying these signals enter the cord from the extremities or the trunk, and then they enter the dorsal columns on the dorsal side of the spinal cord. Now, in the dorsal columns, the tract ascends on the ipsilateral side of the cord until it reaches the medulla, which is where it decussates or crosses. That's worth knowing. The dorsal columns decussate in the medulla, and then they're called the medial lemniscus. We'll look at the location of the medial lemniscus in the brainstem shortly. And then the medial lemniscal fibers terminate in the thalamus in the ventral posterolateral nucleus, the VPL, and then that projects to the sensory cortex. The thalamus is like a relay station between the spinal cord and the cortex. Now, you probably won't have to regurgitate a bunch of these picky details for step one. They mostly want you to be able to localize lesions. So remember, proprioception, vibration sense, and fine touch are carried by the dorsal columns, which decussate in the medulla and then become the medial lemniscus in the brainstem. Next is the spinothalamic tract, which carries pain and temperature sensation. Remember, spinal tracts are named from where they come from first and then where they're going. So the spinothalamic tract is carrying pain and temperature sensation from the spine to the thalamus. The nerve fibers enter the cord and ascend just 1 to 2 levels in something called Lissauer's tract, and then they decussate in the anterior white commissure, just anterior to the gray matter in the center of the spinal cord. So the spinothalamic tract decussates in the anterior white commissure, and then it ascends contralaterally and eventually reaches the thalamus relay station in the sensory cortex. This is different from the dorsal columns, which ascended all the way to the brainstem before they crossed in the medulla. Now, there's a similar tract for the pain and temperature sensation of the face, which is called the trigeminothalamic tract. Because remember, the trigeminal nerve provides the sensory innervation of the face. And the trigeminothalamic tract and the spinothalamic tract run together in the brainstem. But cranial nerves generally don't decussate. So, on the right side of the brainstem, the spinothalamic tract is carrying pain and temperature information from the left side of the body, and adjacent to that you find the trigeminothalamic tract carrying pain and temperature information from the right side of the face. Then our third spinal tract, for now, is the lateral corticospinal tract. So this is carrying motor information from the cortex to the spinal cord. It's corticospinal. From the motor cortex, the signal comes down through the internal capsule, through the brainstem into the medullary pyramids, and there it decussates in the caudal medulla. And then that goes down into the spinal cord. Next, let's look at some cross-sectional anatomy of the various levels of the brainstem. Now, you could be asked to identify structures on the brainstem, but again, you're more likely to have to identify the location of a brainstem lesion based on the clinical presentation. Understanding these cross-sections will make it a lot easier. You can divide the brainstem into the main zones: the midbrain at the top, the pons in the middle, and the medulla at the bottom. So let's start at the top with the midbrain, and then we'll work our way down. Now, in the study guide, there's a diagram of the rostral midbrain. Technically, each level of the brainstem can be divided into a rostral portion and a caudal portion. So rostral means beak, kind of like rooster, rostral. And then caudal means tail. So the rostral medulla is the portion closest to the beak, and the caudal medulla is the portion closest to the tail. Or you can remember that rostral rhymes with nostril, so the rostral is the portion closest to the nose. So again, this is a drawing of the rostral midbrain. It's the superior portion of the midbrain, closest to the nose, farthest from the tail. And you know it's the rostral midbrain because you can see a prominent red nucleus on each side. If you see the red nucleus, you know you're in the rostral midbrain. This white space in the center of the midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct, which is filled with CSF. And the darker area surrounding the aqueduct is the periaqueductal gray matter. Now, because this is the rostral or superior midbrain, posterior to the aqueduct, we're going to find the superior colliculi. If you flip back a few pages in your study guide to the cranial nerve drawings, you're going to see the superior colliculi up here in the midbrain. And remember, the superior colliculi houses the vertical gaze center, so a lesion here would cause paralysis of upward gaze. Now, speaking of cranial nerves, which cranial nerve nuclei do we find in the midbrain? Well, if 5, 6, 7, 8 are in the pons, then you can remember 3 and 4 are a little higher in the midbrain. And remember that the cranial nerve nuclei descend in numerical order from top to bottom. So in the superior midbrain, you find the cranial nerve 3 nuclei, which are these two black dots. And in the inferior or caudal midbrain, instead of the cranial nerve 3 nuclei, you'd find the nuclei for cranial nerve 4. Now, moving laterally, you have the medial lemniscus. I know it's weird that the medial lemniscus is found laterally in the midbrain, but down in the medulla and in the pons, it's located more medially, as we're going to see. We'll see the medial lemniscus traveling throughout the brainstem, carrying vibration and proprioception and fine touch information from the dorsal columns up to the thalamus. So keep track of where the medial lemniscus is going. Nearby is the spinothalamic tract, and then lateral to that is the medial geniculate body. Now, on the anterior part of the midbrain, these two big wing-looking things are the cerebral peduncles, which house the corticobulbar tract and the corticospinal tract. We're going to see the corticospinal tract traveling through all these levels of the brainstem too, so keep track of that as well. And then this dark stripe of tissue is the substantia nigra, which is damaged in patients with Parkinson's disease. So that's the rostral midbrain. Now, we don't have a drawing of the caudal midbrain, but again, you can identify the caudal midbrain because you will not see the red nucleus, and then instead of the superior colliculus, you're going to have the inferior colliculus. And instead of the cranial nerve 3 nuclei, you have the cranial nerve 4 nuclei. Next up is the pons. And for the pons, I want you to divide it into the medial pons and the lateral pons. Let's start with the medial pons. The medial pons contains the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which is involved in eye control, and the medial lemniscus again. I told you to keep track of that. Then you also see the abducens nerve nucleus and the corticospinal tract, which is traveling down from the cortex, and it's eventually going to end up in the medullary pyramids. And the reason that you want to lump these medial structures together is that they receive blood supply from the median and paramedian branches of the basilar artery, which penetrate the pons. So a basilar artery stroke could selectively knock out these medial structures. The lateral aspect of the pons is supplied by the AICA, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is a circumferential artery that circles around the outside of the pons. So the AICA supplies blood to the structures in the lateral pons, which include the lateral spinothalamic tract, the cranial nerve 7 nucleus, the cranial nerve 8 nucleus, and the spinal trigeminal nucleus and tract, which is associated with cranial nerve 5. Cranial nerve 5 has a really huge nucleus that runs from the top of the pons all the way down into the medulla. It's enormous. It's also very complicated. But remember, the pons contains the nuclei for cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, 8, and all of those are pictured here. And the most inferior part of the brainstem is the medulla. There are two structures that tell you you're looking at the medulla. The inferior olivary nucleus, which is this big squiggly area, and the medullary pyramids on the anterior aspect of the medulla. So when you see those, you should immediately recognize that you're looking at the medulla. Now, what's found in the medullary pyramids? The corticospinal tracts, descending from the motor cortex. This happens to be a drawing of the rostral medulla. And again, you need to think about a medial portion and a lateral portion. The medial medulla contains the medullary pyramids, the medial lemniscus again, and here you can see it's rotated 90 degrees, so it truly is medial, and also the hypoglossal nucleus, cranial nerve 12. And all three of those medial structures are supplied by the anterior spinal artery, which runs right along the anterior surface of the medulla in the groove between the pyramids. But the lateral portion of the rostral medulla is supplied by the pica, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which wraps around the medulla on its way to the cerebellum. The lateral medulla contains the lateral spinothalamic tract, carrying pain and temperature information from the body, the spinal trigeminal nucleus and tract, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the vestibular nuclei. And we said that cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12 originate in the medulla. We already saw the hypoglossal nucleus in the medial medulla, that's cranial nerve 12, but in the lateral medulla you have the nucleus ambiguus, which is involved in speech and swallowing. So it contributes motor neurons to the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9, and also the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. There's also the dorsal motor nucleus, which contributes to the vagus nerve, and the nucleus of the solitary tract, also called the nucleus solitarius, which also contributes to the vagus nerve. So again, you definitely want to know which brainstem structures are medial and which ones are lateral, and what level you find them. But it's probably much less important to be able to label all these images. There's also something called the reticular activating system, which is made up of a bunch of structures running through all levels of the brainstem, as well as structures in the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The reticular activating system mediates alertness and wakefulness and arousal. So a lesion of the reticular activating system will result in stupor and coma. We've mentioned that the vagus nerve is the primary parasympathetic nerve in the body and how it has a bunch of different functions: parasympathetics, motor, general sensory, special sensory, and so on. Well, because of this complexity, the vagal nerve receives contributions from several different nuclei. The nucleus ambiguus contributes motor innervation to the pharynx, the larynx, and the upper esophagus. So again, I want you to associate the nucleus ambiguus with speech and swallowing. The nucleus solitarius receives the vagus nerve's sensory information from the pharynx and the trachea and the esophagus, and also taste sensation from the very back of the tongue. It also receives the taste information from the facial nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve, and information from the carotid body chemoreceptors via the glossopharyngeal nerve as well. And then the dorsal motor nucleus contributes parasympathetic fibers to the GI tract and the heart and the lungs. Now, don't get tripped up by the fact that it's called the dorsal motor nucleus. It actually contains parasympathetics. Now, what about the sympathetic nervous system? Where's that located? Well, the sympathetic nervous system has its cell bodies not in the brainstem, but rather down in the spinal cord at the T1 to L3 levels. And these cell bodies synapse with the sympathetic ganglia outside the spinal cord, such as the superior cervical ganglion. And that brings us to a brief discussion of Horner syndrome. Horner syndrome is a disorder of the sympathetic innervation of the face. So the three main features of Horner syndrome are ptosis, or drooping of the eyelid, miosis, or constriction of the pupil, and anhidrosis, absence of sweating, and also flushing of the affected side. So this sympathetic innervation of the face might be disrupted with a lung tumor in the apex of the lung that compresses the sympathetic trunk as it travels from the thoracic spine up to the face. So you can also see Horner syndrome in certain spinal cord disorders like advanced syringomyelia. And then also you can see it with a stroke of the lateral medulla, which we're going to go over when we finally talk about brainstem strokes. Now that we've reviewed the anatomy of the brainstem, from the midbrain to the pons to the medulla, let's keep working our way downward and review the anatomy of the spinal cord. We looked at the function of the spinal cord tracts, so now we're going to take a little closer look at how these tracts are arranged within the spinal cord. So there's a drawing in your study guide, and I want you to pause the video and label as much of this as you can, then restart the video and we'll go through them together. Letters A and B make up the dorsal columns, which we said carries proprioception, light touch, and vibration sensation. So letter A is the fasciculus cuneatus, which carries information from the upper body and the arms toward the brain. And then letter B is the fasciculus gracilis, which carries information from the lower body and the legs. It may help you to think about feet walking on the grass, to remember that the fasciculus gracilis carries information from the lower body. You can also remember that the dorsal columns are arranged like the body is, with the legs on the inside and the arms on the outside. So, does this drawing in the study guide show the upper spinal cord or the lower spinal cord? Well, it must be the upper spinal cord because you do have a fasciculus cuneatus. In the lower spinal cord, you really only see the fasciculus gracilis. And where do the dorsal columns decussate? In the medulla, remember? And what tract do they become in the brainstem? They become the medial lemniscus. Letter C is Lissauer's tract, which we said was the tract that carries pain and temperature signals from the body to the spinal cord, and it ascends one or two spinal levels and then crosses over to the spinothalamic tract. So, where is the spinothalamic tract? That's letter H and letter I. Letter H is the ventral or anterior spinothalamic tract, and then letter I is the lateral spinothalamic tract. The lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature sensation, and the anterior spinothalamic tract carries crude touch or pressure sensation. So light touch is the dorsal columns, crude touch is the ventral spinothalamic tract. Now there are a couple more ascending tracts we just haven't mentioned yet. Letter J is the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Letter K is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Both of these carry proprioceptive signals from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Then the rest of these are descending tracts, which carry signals from the brain down to the rest of the body. Letter D is the lateral corticospinal tract, which carries motor commands from the motor cortex to the rest of the body. Remember, this tract decussates in the medullary pyramids on its way down. And you should also know that it's organized opposite from the dorsal columns. So the fibers carrying signals to the legs are located in the lateral part of the lateral corticospinal tract, and the signals for the arms are carried in the medial part of the tract. So you can match up the L's. The legs are lateral. There's also a ventral or anterior corticospinal tract, which is letter G. It's much smaller than the lateral corticospinal tract, and it's less important, but it's also involved in motor control. Then letter E is the vestibulospinal tract, which carries signals from the vestibular apparatus to the body. Signals about head position and head tilt to help you with reflexive postural control to keep you upright. And letter F is the reticulospinal tract, which carries signals from the reticular formation of the brainstem to the rest of the body. These signals are also involved in postural control, and they help modulate pain and autonomic function. But the most important tracts for you to be able to identify are the dorsal columns, the spinothalamic tracts, and the lateral corticospinal tracts, the same ones we went over at the beginning. And speaking of postural control and balance, let's talk briefly about the Romberg test. The Romberg test is where you have the patient stand with her feet together, then you have her close her eyes and see if she can maintain her balance, which is normal, or whether she falls over. So why do we do this? What are we testing for? Well, there are three sources of information that help you maintain your balance. Proprioception in the legs, vision, which helps you tell if you start to lean one way or the other, and the vestibular apparatus. So if the patient can't stand even with her eyes open, you know there's something wrong with either their vestibular apparatus or the proprioception. But assuming she can stand with her eyes open, you have her close her eyes, and that's going to eliminate the visual input. Now she's just left with proprioceptive input and vestibular input. And if proprioceptive input is damaged, the patient's going to fall. So the Romberg test is a test of dorsal column function, which carries that proprioceptive signal. It's not a test of cerebellar function. Let me say that again. The Romberg test does not test the cerebellum. Dr. Romberg saw lots of patients with tertiary syphilis, and he developed this test as a way to check for tabes dorsalis, which affects the dorsal columns and proprioception. Let's talk about a couple of other points of anatomy that have clinical applications, starting with the intervertebral discs. Remember that the spine is a column of vertebrae stacked on top of one another, and in between the vertebrae are discs of cartilage called intervertebral discs, which act as shock absorbers and allow the spine to bend and twist. The outer portion of the disc is called the annulus fibrosus. Annulus means ring. This is basically a ring of tough fibrocartilage that contains a lot of strong type 1 collagen and also type 2 collagen. And then the center of the disc is called the nucleus pulposus, which is much softer and more gel-like for maximum cushioning and shock absorption. But if that annulus degenerates over time, the nucleus pulposus can herniate through posteriorly, and it can compress the nerve roots, especially at the lower lumbar spine. And as it compresses the nerve roots, this can cause nerve pain, numbness, tingling, or weakness. And because the nerve root exits the spinal canal at the neuroforamen below the vertebrae, herniation of the L4-L5 disc will compress the L5 nerve root. Herniation of the L5-S1 disc will compress the S1 nerve root. And compression of the S1 nerve root will cause pain down the back of the leg and loss of the ankle reflex. And then one last brief bit of anatomy to review is the three layers of the meninges, which are the protective coverings of both the spinal cord and the brain. The meninges are made up of three distinct layers. The pia mater, which is thin and delicate and clings firmly to the outer surface of the brain and spinal cord. Then outside the pia is the arachnoid mater, which is kind of like a mesh or webbing. That's where the name arachnoid comes from. It's like spider webs, arachnids. Both the pia and the arachnoid are derived from the neural crest cells. And then between the pia and the arachnoid is the subarachnoid space, which is where the CSF is found. Then the outermost covering is the dura mater, which is thick and tough and durable, hence the name. Dura means hard. And the dura is derived from mesoderm. Then outside the dura is the epidural space, which is sort of a potential space between the dura and the skull, or the spinal canal and the spinal cord, where there's a little fat and some vasculature. But in the skull, you can have bleeding in this space from head trauma, and that forms an epidural hematoma. And in the spinal cord, we can deliver anesthetic into the epidural space to help relieve the pain of childbirth, for instance. Now it's time for the end of session quiz. So pause the video and answer those questions, then we'll go over them together. First question, what artery supplies the medullary pyramid and the medial lemniscus in the medulla? That's the anterior spinal artery. Next, what artery supplies the inferior cerebellar peduncle, the nucleus ambiguus, and the lateral spinothalamic tract in the medulla? These are all supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or the pica. Next, where does each of the following spinal tracts decussate? So the first two, the lateral corticospinal tract and the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, decussate in the medulla. And the spinothalamic tract decussates in the anterior white commissure of the spinal cord, 1 or 2 spinal levels above where it entered the cord. Next, which spinal tracts convey the following types of information? Light touch, proprioception, and vibration sensation, that's the dorsal columns, which includes the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. Voluntary motor command from the motor cortex to the body is the lateral and ventral corticospinal tracts. Pain and temperature sensation is the lateral spinothalamic tract. Important for postural adjustments and head movements is the vestibulospinal tract. And proprioceptive information to the cerebellum is the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts. And the last question, what is the triad of Horner syndrome? We said that was ptosis, meiosis, and anhidrosis. And that's it for the end of session quiz. I'll see you next time.
Welcome back, dear viewer. Are you ready for some more questions? James, you're on the line.
Yeah, hey there, guys.
Hello, James.
I was wondering, if a patient has a positive Romberg test, where's the neurological lesion located?
That's a great question. And to answer your question, James, I will need the help of Monster. Monster, rise. Feet together and eyes closed. This is an example of a positive Romberg test, where the neurological lesion is located in the dorsal columns of the spinal cord, not in the cerebellum.